Welcome to another enthralling edition of Sports Law Unscripted. Unscripted, as you know, is the weekly sports podcast of Sports Law team of Barcelona and LP. As usual, I have a number of my colleagues on the show today. Thankfully, we are coming back after a relatively long hiatus. My name is Steve Nwabueze. I'm your host for this podcast, and I welcome my colleagues, ID.
Good afternoon, Mr. Steve, and good afternoon, listeners. It's another edition of Sports Law Unscripted, and like always, I'm very glad to be here to share my thoughts. Thank you.
And I have Ayodeji too. Ayodeji.
Good afternoon, everyone, and good afternoon to our listeners. It's always good to be back on the show. Thank you, Mr. Nwabueze.
All right. Without any much ado, we go straight to the menu for today. Obviously, the discussion in the past few days have been about the Europa and Super League, which is a novel competition being spearheaded by what I call reigning clubs in Europe. So we'll be dissecting some of the legal ramifications. We'll be sharing initial thoughts on the legal ramifications of this move. We're looking at the competition implications of this move. We'll be looking at the contractual implications. We're looking at the employment law perspective. And last but not least, the intellectual property law issue that might possibly arise from this. So I would like to invite my colleague, Ayodeji Abdul, to just give us a view of what the European Super League is all about. Is the furor about this particular area, and why has it raised so much dust and opposition from mainstream football regulators like FIFA and UEFA? Ayodeji.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nwabueze. That is a great question. It is no news that certain big teams in quote have decided to take themselves away from the traditional UEFA Champions League that we know to create their own European Super League. So what is all the noise about? The Super League is a league of about 12 founding clubs that are big clubs from different leagues from England, about 6 from England, 3 from Spain, 3 from Italy, then about 2 or thereabout to join from Germany. So these clubs have come together and they've said, no, we want to take ourselves away from the UEFA Champions League. We want to create our own Super League, where most likely they have a huge control of participants of the league, and they determine who plays and who does not play. But much of it is every season, the 12 teams get to play because they are the ones, they are the major stakeholders in the league. And they admit qualifying clubs from different leagues. So what is the reason behind the move? Basically, we should not deceive ourselves. The rationale behind the move is more economic than anything, because the 12 teams are big guns, they have the best players, and they have the best outlook out there. So they've come together and they've said that they are leaving the UEFA Champions League and they are playing their own league. And they also discovered that the UEFA itself gains about 51% of its revenue from media rights of the UEFA Champions League, which is a very huge amount. And they've also seen the potentials of the league. So, and they have much of the viewers behind them and all that. So they decided to set their own league apart and all that. So there are certain legal issues that will be arising from this. As Mr. Nwabueze has mentioned, certain competition laws competition law issues. Also, there are also disciplinary situations arising from this, because as at yesterday, there are news here and there about sanctions that would be levied on players by the Premier League One, the UEFA, and even FIFA. So how are we going to go about these disciplinary situations? And there has been also, the media has cited a particular letter, because the the 12 teams that are taking this move, they've preempted this action and they know the consequences of their action. They know there will be legal consequences. So they've taken certain legal steps to protect themselves. They've written the UEFA, they've written the Premier League, and they've also filed a motion in the regular courts to sort of prevent the UEFA and other regulatory bodies from their sanctions. One of their strongest points is abusive dominant position, which the UEFA stands at.
Ayodeji, we'll come to that. We'll come to the
Okay.
legal ramifications. Yes, I just wanted you to give our listeners an overview of what Rory is about the European Super League. So, ID, I'm coming to you now. I did mention in his overview that the renegade clubs, as I call them, know the consequences of what they are about to do. And just yesterday, just a few hours before the dramatic twist to the whole thing, I'm sure a lot of our listeners already know that about 10 of these clubs have pulled out of this initiative, mainly due to pressure from fans, pressure from the regulators. When I mention the regulators here, I'm referring specifically FIFA and UEFA. So a lot of them have backed on this initiative, notably the 6 English clubs and the Indian teams in the whole thing, meaning just Real Madrid and Barcelona. Someone hilariously, as I said, from Big 12 to Big 2 or Super 2. So these are the issues. So he did mention that there are legal ramifications. Now, just a few hours before the potpourri of, how do I put it, movements from the initiative by some of the clubs involved in the whole thing, there was a ruling from a Spanish court, from a Spanish high court, more or less like a measure restraining UEFA and FIFA from stopping them from making. Surprisingly, a few hours after that ruling came out, the English clubs, all the 6 English clubs, backtracked. This morning, the Italian teams followed suit. There has been no official statement from Barcelona. There has been no official statement from Real Madrid regarding their position on the matter. But I think the silence is very ominous. So, Heidi, I'm coming to you now. Do you think, from looking at the regulations, the FIFA statutes and everything, do you think that FIFA indeed, or even UEFA, because the comments credited to the UEFA president yesterday, Alexander Seferin, where he was more or less issuing threats to the clubs that they will be expelled and they will be removed from ongoing competitions. Of course, we know a number of these teams have advanced to the semi-final stage of the UEFA Champions League and the Europa League. So my question to you, do you think that looking at the regulations that FIFA and indeed UEFA actually have the powers to make good their threats?
All right, thank you, Mr. Steve, for that question. I quite understand the rationale behind this move. Like Ayodeji said, it's mostly commercial. I understand the fact that the big clubs, or what you've rightly christened the renegade clubs, are behind most of the revenue coming into these major competitions by virtue of their fan base. They feel they should have more of the pie, and their grouse is understandable. But away from that, it's necessary to, in order to answer your question, it's necessary to restate the fact that the Premier League rules, I think I restrict myself to the Premier League rules. The Premier League rules makes it clear, very clear, that clubs have to comply with their rules, the FIFA statutes, and the statutes of UEFA. So in making an attempt to join the ESL, that's the European Super League, these clubs could end up in breach of the Premier League's regulatory framework, as far as I'm concerned. So in essence, the Premier League has the option to impose sanctions on these clubs, probably expel them from the league, which will be the very extreme move to say, or very extreme action to take, or even deduct points from them. And I dare to say that UEFA also has such similar rights. So obviously, because the rights given to it flows accordingly from FIFA down to UEFA, which then dovetails into the various rules of the Premier League. So in answering your question, I absolutely know and believe that the UEFA Union of European Footballing Associations, that's UEFA, and the FA Premier League rules have the right to impose such sanctions as they have represented. However, I need to state that from the body language and from the litany of activities that is going to happen, it's going to be very political in terms of negotiations. What's basically going to happen is that parties need to come to the negotiation table again. I don't think it would be commercially wise for either UEFA or the FA Premier League to carry on those sanctions as been proposed, because obviously because of the commercial base and the fan base of these clubs and the effect it will have on the league. So it will come down to political engagement and all. But to answer your question, I believe and I know that the FA Premier League and the UEFA has the right to dole out those sanctions against those clubs. Thank you.
So let's look at the FAPL rules. Now, the FAPL rules obviously empowers the league to expel a member. Now, here's the catch. All 6 teams who are spearheading this initiative from England, collectively, they own about 30% voting rights. The remaining 14 clubs have only 70%. Now, if it was to get to the point of voting, the 14 remaining clubs would only be able to 70% of the voting rights, which falls 5% shy of the plenitude of votes required to expel a member from the league. Now, it is interesting because I read something again this morning where a CEO of one of the 14 clubs was suggesting that this regardless of the backtracking by these teams, that they should be kicked out of the league. Now, it gets me thinking, all 14 remaining teams in the Premier League have only 70% voting rights. 6 renegade teams have 30% rights. So like I said, if you were to come down to voting, exercising the voting rights, the voting power, the 14 teams, interestingly, cannot expel any member of the 6 renegade teams. So it's about numbers, it's a game of numbers now. Some other quarters have suggested perhaps imposing a fine or deduction. Well, I will come to that, but in the meantime, I want to look at the competition law implications of this particular move. What are the competition law implications of this move? We all know that FIFA rules and UEFA rules, well, they don't really have a life of their own. By that I mean they're also subject to some other laws, some other national laws. One of these laws is the ECA laws. The competition law provision in the laws of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, TFEU, which will have wide-ranging ramifications for any step that UEFA, indeed the other leagues, I mean the La Liga and the English Premier League. So there's a limit to what they can do to stop this initiative. already I did mention that an action was filed in courts and an interim order was obtained from a Spanish court just yesterday, stopping UEFA and the other parties from stopping this initiative just a few hours before we were serenaded with a lot of backtracking by the 6 teams from England, Italian teams this morning. So when you look at these rules, because it is not unusual for athletes or professional footballers, of course, we saw that from Bosman, where players approach the courts to challenge decisions of regulatory bodies. Now, within a competition law context, specifically also 101, 102 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, the TFEU, there are certain acts that are expressly prohibited. Now, first of all, we have to bear in mind that football is not necessarily an entertainment, just merely for entertainment. It's also a business activity, an economic activity. So long as it's an economic activity, there are two major decisions that have established the fact that they come, to the extent that they are economic activities, they come within the precincts or within the application of the ECA rules, specifically the TFEU. So what it means, I have the World Rave case and the Mecca case. The Mecca case is very interesting because that was where the principal rule of sporting exemption was laid down. What is the rule of sporting exemption? When a case is brought before the General Court of the European Union, you have the General Court of the European Union, you have the CJEU, Justice of the European Union, which is an appellate division of the EU courts. So when a matter is brought before these courts, the question that is usually put forward is whether the activity is an economic activity. So like I said before, football is not purely a sporting activity. So ECA rules recognize the fact that certain rules are made just for sport purposes. A typical example is the anti-doping rules incorporated in the various employment contracts with players and the football clubs. Now, another example is the laws of specifically the law that stipulates how many number of players you field in a given competition, how many substitutions you make in a game, the length, the duration of the game. All these ones are strict sporting reasons. And so the competition law provisions of the TFEU will not apply. Section 101, Section 102 will not apply. Now, what is Section 101 talking about? Section 101 is making prohibitions of agreements entered into by undertakings. Undertakings, you mean companies, group of individuals, an amount of companies coming to enter into an agreement that will be seen to expressly prohibit, restrict, or inhibit competition. So now, if I was a lawyer, and I'm sure that is what the ESL teams are thinking about. If I was their lawyer, this case is a simple case of competition law that we are trying to set up a undertaking that will rival what is being given, the goods and services or the services being provided by the UCL teams, UEFA teams. So by the time you bring it to court and they now come back and say, okay, now I'm thinking with respect to maybe agreements that we are not privy to, agreements between the clubs and UEFA or between their domestic leagues, where they agree expressly not to secede or move away from the UEFA competitions to establish a parallel league. So if there was any such agreement, Section 101 of the TFEU renders particular agreement unenforceable and void. So depending on how the issues are brought before the court, depending on how the arguments are canvassed before the court, but the important thing here is to note that to the extent that we all agree that in the football industry, what we see, the transfers, the merchandising deals that we see are all construed as economic activities. And if they are construed as economic activities, it goes without reason to say that, yes, that they are amenable to the provisions of the TFEU, specifically Section 101 of the TFEU. So any agreements that, now we are hypothetically, we're not privy to any such agreement. Any agreement entered into by the renegade clubs and their domestic leagues on the one hand, with UEFA, is null and void and unenforceable against them. So UEFA can go to court and say and seek an injunction restraining them from embarking on this initiative. It will be anti-competitive. Now, it also talks about decisions, because I was a bit bemused when I heard comment from the British Prime Minister when he said, oh, that's going to impose a 50+1 rule. The 50+1 rule is a rule that is very, very popular in Germany. It simply means that you are divesting ownership of the football club to the fans. Bayern, Borussia Dortmund, RB Leipzig, all the notable German teams, all by these rules. And that was one of the major reasons why they couldn't initially join this initiative, even though they were mooted as, the 3 other remaining founding clubs to join the fray when the time comes. So British Prime Minister, like I said, was mooting the idea of implementing this rule. And there's a lot of legal hurdles. First, this law cannot apply retroactively because it would have been promulgated after the fact. Says the initiative was already in place before the law or regulation comes into effect. Now, imagine UEFA and FIFA coming together and saying, okay, because there were also insinuations about a possible ban of the players of the European Super League. So now we are talking about a possible ban of these players. It comes within the interpretation. It comes within Article 101 of the TFEU, which prohibits decisions taken by concerted decisions or efforts taken by undertakings, whose ordinary and natural effect is to restrict, prohibit, or distort. So these things or these activities will not only fall under Article 101 of the TFEU, they will be unenforceable and they will be deemed null and void. So that is what I want to bring out. Interestingly, Article 102 of the TFEU talks about somebody occupying a dominant market position. UEFA is obviously occupying a dominant market position because it has enjoyed monopoly providing services strictly in the European Union. So the 27 member states of the European Union, who are members of the EU, and who are also members of UEFA by extension, all come within the application of this law. So I'm disagreeing with you that UEFA and FIFA, and by extension, domestic leagues, can actually, they might be able to individually, in some form of disciplinary procedure, but placing an outright ban or stopping the initiative, I do not think, with the greatest respect.
Well, Mr. Steve, I think I need to come in there. In answering that question, I was careful to pigeonhole myself within the powers of UEFA, FIFA, and the FA Premier League to expel these teams and to put such sanctions as they may feel on the teams that are participating in this European Soccer League. I didn't speak to whether they have the power to stop them from carrying out the league. I didn't speak to that. So in aligning with you, in all honesty, I think I completely agree with your position that when you look at Section 101 of the Treaty on the Functionality of the EU, yes, it stops any agreement, it makes a nullity of any agreement that seeks to restrain trade, it issues as to predatory pricing and the rest of it. And within that context, Florentino Perez and Agnelli have the requisite European powers to form this renegade league, if you permit me to call them that. But within the context of whether the FA Premier League and FIFA and UEFA can put some kind of disciplinary measures against these clubs, I think they do. But that does not stop them from carrying out or establishing a parallel league.